And welcome to the Interim Joint Committee on Education for Wednesday, September 1st at 1 o'clock. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's meeting. I know we got a number of guests that are here in the audience. We also have some legislators that are not on the Education Committee, but that are with us either in the audience in front of me, or they're seated at the committee table surrounding me. I would ask, if you have a cell phone, if you please turn that to silence or vibrate. It would be greatly appreciated during our meeting today. Also, we have some members that are joining us remotely. Remote members, when the roll is called, indicate if you are in your home area or if you're in your annex office. And when you join the meeting, your microphones are automatically muted, so please remember to unmute your microphone before speaking. If you have a question or comment during the committee meeting, please indicate that in the meeting chat function. And once again, I'm pleased to welcome any other legislators that are not members of the Education Committee that are here today. I do ask, if you are a non-Education Committee member legislator, if you have questions or comments, we will get to you at close to the end of the committee meeting, but please allow the Education Committee members to have first priority in questions that they may ask today. Mariah, if you would, please call the roll.
Senator Carroll. Senator Givens. Senator Harper Angel. Senator Higdon. Senator Kerr. I see her online. Senator Kerr. I can't see. Senator Meredith.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Senator Neal. Senator Southworth. Senator Stivers. Thank you. Senator Thomas.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Senator West.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Senator Wilson.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Baker.
Remote from home.
Thank you. Representative Banta.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Bojanowski.
I'm present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Decker.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Donahue.
Yes, ma'am. Present.
Thank you. Representative Dossett.
Present virtually from the 9th District.
Thank you. Representative Lewis.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Massey.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative McCool.
Here in the room.
Thank you. Representative Miller. Thank you. Representative Gibbons-Prunty. Representative Rayburn.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Riley.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Scott.
Present in District 41.
Thank you. Representative Timoney.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Tipton.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative Weber.
Present in the room.
Thank you. Representative White. Representative Wilner.
Present in the 35th House District.
Thank you. Co-Chair Huff. Present in the room. Thank you. Chair Wise.
Present in the room. Thank you so much. I do want to recognize my co-chair, Co-Chair Huff. I'm not sure if you have any opening comments you would like to make before we get started.
Let's just get started.
Perfect. Sounds good. Once again, welcome everyone.
Chairman, this is Alice Kerr, and I can barely hear you all now. I couldn't hear you at all when we started, but I'm present in the district.
Thank you, Senator Kerr. We'll take note of that as well for our staff. Thank you. Today's meeting is basically an open dialogue amongst committee members, but also some shareholders within the education community as we prepare for what may be forthcoming with a special session as it relates to education. We'll be talking specifically today about K through 12 education. And with that, I first want to start off by first thanking all of our frontline workers across the Commonwealth in our hospitals, EMS, all different services they're providing, also to our educators and all the different capacities as we're trying to all get through the situation that's facing us again with COVID-19. So great appreciation for all of those that are doing their job each and every day. In terms of members that have came to me, and I've been very appreciative of this, I've had many members on the Education Committee, many of the legislators that have been sending emails and text messages to me with conversations that they've had with their superintendents, with educators, with school personnel and staff in their home districts, and I greatly appreciate that. The more input and the better listening we can do, the better we are at drafting pieces of legislation and trying to work together on an overarching goal and policy. I personally believe that overarching goal and policy should be to continue as much in-person learning education at all possible throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky. That is also in a safe manner. Last year, we know what COVID-19 did to many of our school children with having to adjust from in-person education to virtual learning, the constraints that it put on parents working, children trying to adapt to a new learning style of virtual education, and then also hearing from frustrations and also some success stories that came from that. But the goal of this year, and I'm not taught to a single educator or superintendent that the goal has not been, let's do whatever it takes to keep us in person in the school buildings. Now we know also with facing COVID-19 that has posed some constraints. Today's discussion needs to get into some of the biggest key issues, and I'm going to rattle 3 things off that I would really like to focus on for myself, and we'll see where these discussions go. The first off is funding. One of the biggest concerns I've heard from superintendents in my districts as well as superintendents across the state is the funding mechanisms, especially as it relates to average daily attendance and being worried about where they are right now because of absenteeism. So the funding purposes, we really need to have a close look today as it relates to that attendance. There's been discussions from many groups, and I think we'll have presented Jim Flynn from the Kentucky Superintendent Association is looking at the model that we went back to with Senate Bill 117 out of 2020 that was pursuant to the 2018-19 school year funding. Got a lot of comments from superintendents. I'm sure other legislators have probably heard the same along those ways as well. Another thing as it relates to funding and attendance from many different superintendents across the Commonwealth is the 170 instructional days and utilizing the equivalent 1,062 hours to accomplish any makeup days that may occur. This has been so much of a need of schools right now that are having to shut down because of situations involving mostly from staffing issues, but also from attendance issues. And what I also consider the most important thing to look at is the quarantine issue of what's causing so much of the attendance problems in the Commonwealth. I've had 2 superintendents reach out to me, one that is quarantining right now over 400 students, but only 8 of those students are positive. I'd like to repeat that again. Over 400 students being quarantined, but only 8 students being positive for COVID-19. It's another district that I know of, an independent district with 75% of students that are pursuing along the lines of a quarantine, that are in quarantine, but only 25% of students that are actually positive. So when we look at these type of numbers, those are the type of discussions we need to be having today. How can we look to manage this? I don't think we're ever going to be truly able to eradicate and eliminate, but we can manage the threat that we're currently under. And we need to do that with common sense, but in a safe manner. The second thing I want to look at today is how we look at quarantining, how we look at creating localized metrics for districts to be able to have local control and a delivery method for them to be able to make decisions based off of their local county level. We know that a one-size-fits-all approach has not worked well. We've had many people that have testified before of a blanket approach that's not been relatable to their home counties. So when we look at that and the discussions that we have today of getting into the discussion of how do we do this from a local level and not just from a blanket approach across the state. One of the models we're going to hear from today, and I'm glad he's going to be with us, joining us at around the 2:30 mark, is the superintendent of Greene County School District, Mr. Will Hodges, who's doing a model called Test and Stay. Some of y'all may have seen this. Utah started this, and other states have gotten on board with this. There's many districts right now doing this in the Commonwealth. Instead of quarantining a class of 30 students, if one is positive, sending 29 home, allow those other 29 to test to see if they are negative to keep them in the classroom. When we talk about the attendance purposes, we talk once again about those that are not positive, once again coming up with a common sense approach and a safe approach that doesn't just send kids home if they're not positive for COVID-19. So I look forward to hearing what Greene County schools are doing. There's more districts out there that are doing this as well. I know in my home district, Russell County is also doing this as well. But many times it gets into the staffing issue. Teachers, staff members that we're finding shortages of as well. And that's the third thing I want to look at today, and that is the issue of staffing, of how we could come up with some approaches, some temporary waivers we can do as it relates to utilizing certified, classified, emergency, substitute, and retired staff. Waiving certain statutory language that's already in place to speed up the process, to maybe speed up background checks by the Kentucky State Police, or maybe doing a third-party vendor, still in a safe manner. We want to make sure that people we're hiring in our school systems are still people that follow a background check, but to expedite those because we are facing such a workforce shortage across the Commonwealth. We also want to look at any type of temporary waivers that can be put into place along those lines. We also want to be able to have superintendents employ all individuals or probationary status, depending on those background checks. And the last thing along the lines of staffing is school districts who may wish to develop any type of incentivized programs for vaccinations. And one thing you did not hear me say in my opening comments is the word mandates. It is my goal today that what we look to do, what we look to drive home, and what we look to have a good, open, honest dialogue across party lines is not pushing down upon school districts mandates to force them to have to do something, but allow them to have trust in them at the local level with local elected officials, local elected school board members, and school personnel and school leadership to make the best decision for their districts. So with that, I would first like to call Mr. Jim Flynn, and I'm going to have Jim on behalf of the Kentucky Association of School Superintendents to kind of give us a discussion, and I really want to look at this in terms of the lines of funding. Many of us, like I said, have heard from our school superintendents, and so we want to hear directly from what Jim, or Mr. Flynn, has been hearing from his colleagues across the state. So, Jim, if you would, please identify yourself for the record, and I'll let you jump right in.
All right. Thank you, Senator. And my name is Jim Flynn. I'm the Executive Director of the Kentucky Association of School Superintendents. And thank you, Chair Wise and Chair Huff and members of the Interim Joint Committee on Education for the opportunity to speak to you today. And you know, I'll just say, Senator Wise, that those opening comments are well in alignment with what I'm hearing from our superintendents across.
Jim, do you have your microphone on? I had members asking.
I think I do. Let's see.
Makes me
Do I
pull it
need to
closer
move
to
it
you.
a little closer?
Perfect.
Is that better?
Thank you, sir.
Okay. But anyway, I think in general, those comments are in well alignment with the concerns that I've heard from superintendents, and we have kind of put forward you know, a list of recommendations that are well aligned to that. I just want to open by saying that our superintendents are working hard to keep educational services in place for our students, and with an emphasis and a priority to in-person educational services, but want to do so in a way that protects everyone's safety and well-being in that process, and also reduces spread to help minimize the impact on our local healthcare systems. But a key to galvanizing our local support in our communities is good, clear information, and specifically, we need good data and evidence at the local, regional, and state levels that can guide superintendents, their boards of education, and the local communities in navigating the complex decisions and actions that must be made during this challenging time. And specifically, though, I want to talk about one of the fundamental pieces to this, particularly in being able to be agile and flexible in those learning services, with a priority being around in-person services. We need to address the funding stabilization piece of the equation, and I think that's kind of job one. If in-person instruction is the priority, and our districts are working really hard to keep the doors open, even on days when attendance rates are very low, it's important to understand the impact that has on next year's budget. And because of the average daily attendance rate influencing how funding will roll into districts for 2021, not just 21-22, but the 22-23 year, based on this year's average daily attendance, we need some help in stabilizing that funding, so that regardless of the attendance rate, our districts can continue to provide in-person services to the students. And so think about this, and I was a superintendent for 16 years, and there were times where, we had a lot of near misses with, kind of pandemic related issues with H1N1 and SARS and MRSA and swine flu and those kinds of things. But we never got into a situation quite like this. But even during those, we were constantly having to evaluate, do we continue to keep our schools open or not because of the impact on ADA? And you get to a point where, that can dramatically impact your funding, particularly for the next school year. And so with the stabilization of funding and taking that off the table, even if your attendance rates get down into 75, 70%, many of our superintendents are looking at it like this. If funding were stabilized and we knew what we could count on for next year, then that's still 70, 75% of students that can come to school and get in-person learning services. That's 70, 75% of families that can still go to work knowing that their students are going to be cared for in a safe, nurturing environment and continue to learn. And so they, superintendents would like to have that flexibility to do that, but they need to know that it's not going to damage their funding for next year. In the past, you all have given us some flexibility through offering districts the option to use 18-19 ADA funding levels, and also have given them the option of choosing between that or 19 and 20, and something like that could work moving forward. The only thing that I would mention there is that some of our districts have had pretty significant increases in their enrollments during that time period, and there may need to be some consideration for some kind of exception clause or process for them to get some additional funding to account for those significant increases in membership over this time period. But with that stabilization of the school funding piece, I think that's foundational to allow districts to continue to operate, particularly on the in-person services component. In conjunction with some other recommendations that we've made, and I've sent those to Chair Wise and Chair Huff and many of the others on this committee, that will help us dramatically. If we have the funding stabilization along with some of those other flexibilities that we've recommended, that I think can really help. So I'll stop there and happy to answer other questions, because I know Eric Kennedy is going to talk a little bit about staffing, and Superintendent Hodges is going to talk about some of the quarantining issues and maybe some strategies there. And some of the things you've already mentioned are on our list, but I'll pause there and see if there's any questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Jim. Jim, do you know right now, talking to superintendents that have had to shift to NTI, if the funding mechanism were to be put into place of looking what we've discussed here of going back to that 18-19 model, would that have, if that had been in place, would that have caused districts not to have made that shift to jump to NTI from any of those you've had discussions with?
Well, I think that would be something that that would be a critical piece of the equation in trying to determine whether they can retain in-person learning services or not. Really, what I hear from most superintendents, it's the staffing issues that due to quarantines or isolations as a result that end up putting constraints on their ability to operate in-person learning. They don't have enough teachers or enough bus drivers, to be able to have in-person school. And that's why, one of the flexibilities I think that needs to be considered is, that if as opposed to just closing down the entire district, if districts and superintendents could have some kind of mechanism to deal with a single school in the district, or even a portion of the school, or even down to a classroom, that would allow them to retain in person for everyone else, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. We have a couple questions. Senator Givens.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And again, thanks for your intro to the meeting. Well done. I think you've created a frame for us to work within that's very, very appropriate. Superintendent Flynn, I'm going to use that title purposely because when I first met you, you were superintendent in our beloved community of Franklin and Simpson County, and thank you for your years of leadership there. I want you to put back on for just a moment that superintendent hat, Jim, and let's go back to the staffing question. Do we, well-intentioned as they may be, do we have inherent obstacles to being able to bring in subs, inherent obstacles to being able to fill a bus driver's seat that may be vacant? Are there things we can do temporarily that you recommend we take a look at in light of this COVID crisis to assist us appropriately in bringing in the talent to keep these schools in person?
Yeah, that really good question, Senator Givens, and specifically what I'm hearing from superintendents, like relative to bus drivers, they can get them trained to take the CDL license, but they're having some difficulties getting them tested to get their CDLs. So, just that pool of drivers has been a challenge on that side of the equation. I talked to a superintendent this morning, for example, who lives in a community where they have some public transit resources, and so he's going to try to reach out to those folks to see if maybe they can get some of their CDL certified people to come in to help them. But that's how dire it's gotten there, because they have so many drivers out. It's hard to staff the routes. And so with the testing to get their CDLs, or maybe access to some other pools of drivers that already have CDLs, that might be something that could help us on that front. On the substitute front, I talked to a superintendent this morning who told me he has only 2 subs that'll come in. Right now there are some constraints around retired teachers and how much they can get paid and how much time they can work. And then, of course, I must acknowledge that many of our retirees, they're in the more vulnerable age group in this, and so some of them are fearful of coming in, and so that's just a fact that we're dealing with. But if we could kind of untether some of those constraints that retired staff members, both certified and classified, that could come in, and we could kind of incent them to come in and help us by lifting some of those current constraints, at least temporarily, that could be helpful, particularly in the sub realm. And then even beyond that, we're still going to be in an education recovery mode, and we have some of the federal funds that districts are looking at ways to kind of mitigate some of the learning loss or damage that's happened as a result of this pandemic over the last 18 months that are continuing on. Maybe that we need to even think about that window beyond just this little surge this year to give us access to more people to help even with that side of the equation. But those are some of the big issues we've talked about. Maybe lifting some constraints on maybe pre-service teachers and student teachers. I think there's already a mechanism in place for student teachers, but to get more subs into the classroom. And so those are some of our initial ideas there. And I'll look here at my list to see if there's anything that kind of else that I want to mention on that. But I think some flexibilities with retirees, some flexibilities with sub teachers, and bus drivers in particular. Those would help us a lot. And then I'll just mention something that Senator Wise mentioned already in his comments. If we could have some flexibilities around the background checks and those kinds of things. We have thought about, right now, they've limited the number of sites for fingerprinting, that's required now through the state police and the FBI checks. But there's other, agencies out there that do comprehensive background checking, and we've looked at a possibility of maybe temporarily allowing districts to use some of those others to expedite that, because even in some of our positions that are not as well paid, to drive 2 hours round trip to a testing site, and the gas money and the time, plus the cost to get the background check for them, that's a hurdle for some of our people that kind of turns them away from us to want to come work for the school district. So maybe some temporary relief there to evaluate some of those kinds of options in background checks.
Mr. Chairman, very brief follow-up. Thank you, Jim, for the answer. The phrase that you've used that I'm not certain I'm familiar with is pre-service teachers. Help me to understand, what's a pre-service teacher as opposed to maybe a student teacher?
Well, I think student teacher, to me, has a connotation to they're actually student teaching in the school. There may be some pre-service teachers that have a schedule that would allow them, to be able to sub, but there might be some constraints that we could look at, that maybe they don't, have enough college hours earned yet, or some things like that. But we could look at some other criteria, that they're more mature, they have some other experiences, and thereby, maybe we could free them up to go ahead and do some subbing for us during this time.
Thank you again. And I'd never thought about the challenge of CDL testing as a constraint and a bottleneck in this process. So thanks for bringing that to our attention.
Yeah. Thank you.
Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. And I will also call you Superintendent Flynn, because that's how I met you, I believe, the first time. Mm-hmm. And of course, we had the opportunity to work together on some workforce solutions when you were at Franklin Simpson. Mm-hmm. And that was a real fun thing to do, I think. And of course, just looking back on it, I appreciate all your input on those situations, because I've talked to both my superintendents, and that's one of the biggest issues they're facing, is in regards to teachers and having enough staff to really take care of that. I guess I wanted to specifically ask, what are the provisions that are in place for kids that are sent home that are tested positive, and those that are in quarantine now? How is that being provided for them to try to keep up while they're gone?
Well, our schools are doing the best they can on that. There is an avenue to provide remote services to students that are in that situation of either quarantine or in isolation. It's challenging with the workforce constraints, because it's important to understand our teachers are working all day in their classrooms with the students that are in person, but then afterwards they have to go and take care of the students that are on some kind of remote learning plan. And then with the limits of subs, they may have to be covering other teachers' classrooms during their planning time. So schools are doing the best they can, but just know our teachers are really having to roll up their sleeves and put in extra time to be able to do those kinds of things under the current circumstances. So these workforce issues, and Eric will talk more about that with you, I'm sure, but if we can get some flexibilities and have some avenues to get more people in to help us, then that will improve that situation, because then our teachers can kind of focus more on what they need to do, whereas now they're having to cover classes and deliver remote services in addition to their in-person classroom responsibilities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one more, if I might.
Please proceed.
Can you explain to us what the difference is with NTI versus virtual academies?
Well, NTI is non-traditional instruction, and that is utilized when you need to close the entire district, but yet continue learning services, whether it's through some kind of virtual remote learning or it's they send a packet of learning home for kids. Predominantly, districts have used it in the past for weather-related closures, and so that they could continue learning remotely during those. Of course, last year you all gave us the flexibility, and we needed it at that time where we were in this pandemic. So districts used it as one avenue to deal with responding to the pandemic. It may be important to have that tool in the toolbox. I've kind of worded this in some of my conversations with you all. Any CEO, regardless of work sector, wants to have all the tools in their toolbox to be able to respond to whatever they need to help their organization operate to the best of its ability in the safest manner possible in a pandemic-like situation like we're in. So our superintendents would like to have as many of those tools available to them, but just know that what I hear from superintendents, their priority is to try to retain in-person learning services as much as possible. And so the NTI, problem is it relates to the whole district. Whereas some of the superintendents have, or many of them have said, if we could have a remote learning option that applies to a single school or a portion of a school or even down to a classroom where they could offer remote learning services, but then continue for everyone else to offer in-person learning, I think that would be a very welcomed flexibility that would be useful to our superintendents and boards and communities in this situation. So we're kind of looking at NTI as a district-wide solution. We may need some limited, options for doing district-wide closures through NTI, but what probably more importantly, a remote learning option, again, that could be one school only or a portion or down to a classroom, would be a welcomed innovation to that side of the equation.
Well, I appreciate that. Of course, talking to mine, they said they probably don't intend on using all of their NTI days as it is, the 10 that they normally get. But I like that where we could do it, particularly by keeping, students in school and just doing it for one class or one school, those options there for the students that can't be in school. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Representative Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Flynn, good to have you with us today. We've got some serious issues to consider. What we've been talking about today is probably what I would consider some short-term solutions to an immediate situation. However, as I look at our situation, I'm more and more convinced each day COVID is here. It's not going away. And I think we have to take into account our long-term policies as well going forward. We're working, we have the school funding task force that's been meeting, and some of what you're talking about are some of the issues that we've been referring to in the discussions in those task force meetings about how we navigate forward. Now, you mentioned a good point. If we go back to the Senate Bill 177 language used of prior year ADA, have you all have some suggestions or ideas how we could implement a policy for those districts that have experienced growth in those districts so they would not be penalized in that type of situation?
Well, we've talked about that. Would love to be a part of a conversation to explore the best way to do that. One idea that superintendents have discussed is, have the funding based on current ADM but then use a prior year ADA rate or even an average of some prior year ADA rates and apply it to the current year ADM. That's one idea I've heard. The other idea would be to create some kind of exception process. So if districts are able to choose 1819 or 1920, like we have in the past, as far as the ADA rate and the funding rate that they would know they could count on for next school year, 22-23, but then have some kind of process that if they meet certain criteria on enrollment growth, that then they could get some kind of growth factor bump that would add on to either 18-19 funding levels or 19-20 funding levels, whichever they choose. And so that would be another mechanism. And just to kind of put it in perspective, I was talking to Dr. Buddy Berry, superintendent in Eminent School District, and it's a smaller school district, but they've had almost a growth of 200 students in that school. And while that may sound not like a huge amount, but when their total budget's only $8 million, that growth of 200 students, and having been a superintendent for 16 years, you don't staff on ADA, you staff on membership. ADM is what we call it, or average daily membership. And so we have to have enough staff, that if everyone showed up, that we have things in place that would allow them to be educated safely and efficiently. And so that's the other idea of maybe. And so when you have a district like Eminence that's had this significant growth, I think Dr. Berry told me that it was approaching $2 million of funding that they would have access to if it were a normal circumstance. So it's a significant issue for them. When you're talking about an $8 million budget, you can see what the math is there in terms of the impact. So some exception process that would allow them to get some bump, and I think we could put our heads together and figure it out. And I'm certain that Robin Kinney and Che Ritter and some of the KDE that know a lot more about how funding works could help us navigate that.
Mr. Chair, could I have a follow-up, please?
Very quickly, please. Thank you.
I've talked to my superintendents quite a bit on this subject of flexibility. With NTI days, the concept you mentioned, if there's one school that has a specific problem. I've also talked to KDE. Now, as I understand it now, if a student is out quarantined, they would have the option to code that student to go virtual on a limited basis. Is it a matter of having staffing or the capability to code a whole school to go virtual for a week or something like that? Are those the types of issues we need to be looking at? And if you could expand on that a little bit, please.
Yeah, I think that if they had the flexibility to, to get down to a classroom level or a wing of the school or just one school in the district, that would allow them, to respond, particularly when the staffing issues, constrain them from being able to operate safely and efficiently. That's what they need. So, however you design the mechanism, I think would be fine. It's just, do they have that tool in their toolbox to be able to respond if needed when the staffing constraints interfere with their ability to operate? So we think some kind of, remote learning flexibility is in order in this situation. There may be limited times where it needs to be whole district-wide, and we call that NTI. There may be some limited options that superintendents would need something like that in their tool belt. But I think primarily it's more down to the classroom portion of the school or the individual school that I hear superintendents talking about the most.
Representative McCool.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Flynn, thank you for being here today and helping us to understand. He's looking for me, okay. To resolve these current issues. And I think you've answered some of my questions already, but I want to kind of just revisit them just to make certain. as I understand, and certainly you know more than I do, but the flexibility with the NTI for calling the school's office a district issue. However, there are two current options, and as I understand, one is to change the calendar of the school, which really is a financial and very difficult problem to resolve at the end of the year. And the other one is to request a waiver through KDE, which that probably takes time. So I guess, and maybe you addressed some of this, but I want to make sure I understand, what would you do differently if these two options are available now?
So there is an option, and I think 140 of our districts have now applied for a waiver to have virtual academies, but those are self-selected. The families request a virtual option, and I do know that when the state board approved that waiver process to allow those virtual academies to serve elementary students. And this is all under a performance-based funding model. And so, again, I was a superintendent for many years, and our district had a virtual academy, but it could only serve grades 6 through 12, and it didn't include elementary. And it was on a performance credit basis. And so what that means is that you didn't get funding for that student until they successfully complete the course, and so that's a little risky when you're the superintendent. And if it's a small group of students, it's not that risky funding wise. Because you even if it doesn't turn out well for you, it's not going to cost you that much. But if that pool of students becomes greater and you don't know what your funding level is going to be until the end when they all pass the courses, that's a risk that becomes a little more disconcerting, if you're the superintendent. And so solving the funding issue with allowing, something like an 1819 or 1920 foundational funding piece, then taking that off the table will be helpful. And so that's been kind of part of the limitations, that how those funding mechanisms are set up for the virtual academies. On the quarantining, that can help for those students that are under quarantine. But when you get into a place, it's not real clear. When you get into a place where your staffing limits the operation of school, then you have a whole bunch of students in there that aren't in quarantine, and then under the current rules aren't eligible, for that funding relief. That's what we're asking for. And so some more flexibility on a remote learning option then would include everybody, regardless of whether they're in quarantine or not, or in isolation or not, to get those services, and the school, knows its funding is stable, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Neal, you're joining us remotely. Your question, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I really appreciate the discussion regarding the flexibility. It makes a lot of common sense given the circumstances. So I think that's probably a no-brainer if you really stop and think about it. But underneath all of this, there are factors such as how would this ultimately impact the budget at the end of the school year, depending on the impact of COVID or its variants. And the other thing that underlies all that is the uncertainty of how COVID or its variants are going to affect a district or a particular school building or whatever the situation is. And I'm just wondering if some consideration should be given, or we should at least look at very carefully this question of extending the days, the NTI days themselves, because of the uncertainty that's associated with this. What we're looking at today, for instance, in Jefferson County Public Schools, about the 692 testing positive right now, as reported. Since August, about over 1,500 with respect to that. It's the largest school district. Don't know how the pathways and impacts would be. So when you talk about flexibility, shouldn't we also consider the expansion of NTI days in some form? I don't have the exact answer for that, but something that makes sense to what we do in terms of budgeting, but also makes sense in terms of the uncertainty, factoring that in.
Senator Neal, appreciate the comment, and you're exactly right. That's the discussion for today, is to look at all these different things that are there. I will tell you personally, from talking to my superintendents, there is not any type of appetite for unlimited NTI. I've not had anyone talk to me that would be in favor of unlimited. Now, in terms of when you mention flexibility, common sense, could we maybe have a discussion around what would be fair to districts? I think we can. But I think if we look to go to a model of unlimited NTI, I would be very afraid of abuse that could possibly come with that. I'm all for child safety, but I'm also not for shutting down, because the goal, once again, Jim, you've mentioned it, and I've mentioned it and others, is in-person learning in a safe manner, if we can continue on that pathway. But Senator Neal, I greatly appreciate those comments, and I think we still can have those
Chairman,
discussions.
If I may, I'd like to put this into context. I thank you for your comment. If I may.
Please, sir. Yes.
I wasn't suggesting, I don't think my question suggested unlimited anything. My question is nothing like that. I acknowledge that the response has to be a common sense one, because you can't just have something open-ended and it just arbitrarily affects the budget. But I'm thinking that should there not be a discussion as to expanding NTI days to fit the situation? I can't sit here and tell what that would be, but there's uncertainty for sure. I mean, we're in a space right now we didn't think we would be in, let's say, 5 months ago. And we don't know where we're going to be 5 months from now. And I'm just saying, should there not be a discussion for us to look at whether or not, or what the effect would be, or the appropriateness of whatever those days may be for NTI? So I want to make sure that we make that clear. I don't want to be framed, and I do not support unlimited anything, but I do support common sense responses to uncertainty in the situation, which we have some history of. That's all.
Exactly.
That's my comment, and thank you for your comments, Mr. Chairman.
Senator, thank you. One of the things also we need to make sure we're focused on, we're looking at the now of going into a special session. What's the fix for now? Remember, we come back in January. We know bad weather, that's always going to occur. We always can deal with weather and situations come January. I think the focus needs to be, and I appreciate the comments, Senator Neal, it needs to be common sense, and what are the discussions that can be? And that may be discussion with Kentucky Department of Education. I know Chuck Truesdale's here in terms of looking at, Chuck, what we did last year with the 10 NTI days, recommendations, and correct me if I'm wrong, and Representative Huff is the one who worked on that bill. Kentucky Department of Education worked hand in hand with the legislation on that bill. And so when looking at those 10 NTI days, there's a lot of misinformation out there that it was just the legislature that came up with that. We were trying to find a point last year of where we were hoping we would start this year of having that. Can we have that discussion? Yes, we definitely can have those types of discussions of what can be maybe a fair number if we're looking to go that direction. Also, we talk about the 1,062 hours. Jim, has there been discussions from school districts to add on 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the day, or start school early to maybe make up days that instead of going into late May, June? I mean, heaven forbid, I remember going to school in June when I was growing up because of bad weather and things such as that. Has that been a discussion on the hours with that?
Yeah, yes. Certainly if the 170-day requirement is lifted and they only have to adhere to the 1,062-hour minimum, which most districts go beyond that, quite honestly, but that would give them more room to be more innovative in how they respond to delivering those services. And I think that would be a good flexibility to provide given the current circumstances.
Good. I'm going to get back. We've got still a whole host of questions here. President Stivers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think some people have alluded to this, but I don't think anybody in this room or that anybody here is not passionate about the fact we want a good end product in education. It's how we get from point A to point B. And I just had a text that some of the educational components we instituted last year just weren't really effective because testing and I think that's probably from the largest system in my district, are not coming back very well with not good scores. We have problems with childcare, parents getting to work. We have the problems with rampant and increasing drug abuse, and I'm not saying in the homes, but it's all part and parcel of being somewhat discombobulated in the way we have come to know what our societal norms are. I think a couple people have mentioned this, but what I'm particularly interested in, because I think I probably have one of the better case studies in my district, in the sense that Corbin City School would probably be more reminiscent of maybe a Louisville or Jefferson County type of situation where they may not miss any days for weather. But then I've got Owsley County that may miss 25 or 30. So you put this in together with all the problems of COVID, and I want to go back a few years. I think we created a mechanism to allow the individual school districts to petition the KDE with a plan, and then the KDE had to sign off on that plan because the dynamics are different. And I appreciate Senator Neal, everybody else that talks about let the local school systems have the flexibility, because Tim Bobrowski is going to have a totally different set of circumstances than Dave Cox is going to have in the two systems. And looking at this semester is one thing for what we have now, but if we have a bad winter, then that's going to come into play. So from the perspective of individual schools, individual classrooms versus district-wide, and the timing of this, should we not look at a semester or a calendar year solution to get us to the point of January, and then as we work through the regular session, look and see how the rest of the year is going to play out in the way of potentially a two-pronged problem in attendance: contagion and weather. So from that perspective, do you all has there been discussions, or should that be the way we start looking at this? Because there is so much difference. And I think I give a good example right in my district when you look at Corbin City versus Owsley County.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that we've learned is the one size fits all solution is usually not going to be the best path forward, because what happens in Corbin City or Owsley County might be different from Hickman County and Simpson County and of course Jefferson County is a whole unique situation there, being our largest urban district. So that's why superintendents are so intent on having those tools in their toolbox and the flexibilities to make the decisions they need to make in conjunction with their school boards and their communities based on that local context, because it's very different and very unique. And one of the other things that we've dealt with is it's hard to explain the whys and the whats and the hows and the whens when we don't have the data at the local, regional, and state level that drives when we're going to do something. And so it's been hard to explain. Like, parents want to know when can we take masks off, or when can we rescind some of these mitigation factors that we need, that they want to know about. And so I think the more clarity we can build into the decisions that we make moving forward, I think that will help communicate that to our local communities. But I think without a doubt, what I hear from superintendents is we need some immediate relief now, until you all get back in session. And then a lot of our superintendents are saying then we also need to build a framework, because we're going to have other variants. There's going to be other things that might come down the pike, and let's build a long-term plan of how we respond based on what we've learned the last 18 plus months. in dealing with this pandemic. But I think we have more time to do that. But the things that we're talking about today are those short-term solutions that we need until you all get back in session for the long term. So I think I think superintendents would agree with that, and that'd be a smart way to go.
I just want to, if I can, just clarify. So let's look at getting through this semester, because there's going to be a totally different set, in my opinion, of dynamics come January, depending on whether we have 1 inch of snow or 10 inches of snow, or recently 5 inches of rain, to compound problems in some of the rural areas. So I may not have articulated it very well the other day, but some people were saying, well, what are you talking about just till the end of the calendar year?
Yeah.
And that's where I think in this type of discussion, we ask for your all's thoughts, and then potentially a mechanism to where an Owsley County may submit a different plan than a Corbin may, and who would look at that for class by class, wing by wing, school by school, differentiation in plans.
Yes. And I've already talked to a lot of superintendents, including Dr. Probowski at Owsley, and he was really toiling with those decisions because he felt like I only have 10 of these days, and I know what my winters are going to look like here. I know what I'm going to be facing, but I know what I'm dealing with right now, and I've got to act. And he did act. He made the decision he felt like he needed to make for his community. So those short-term solutions that you're talking about, President Stivers, I think will relieve them where they know they can do what they need to do, and they can count on their funding being stable, and if they have some of those tools in their toolbox that give them the flexibilities and access to more workforce, then they can work toward those in-person learning services that we all know are so important to our students and their families.
Jim, I have 2 more questions, and then we're going to move on to our next presenter. Representative Rayburn?
Yes, thank you, Jim, for coming today. I've spent some time talking with some of the superintendents within the 4 counties that I represent, and many of them have told me the same thing, that if a teacher or a student shows proof of vaccination, they will not have to quarantine due to an exposure. Do you know, is that a statewide policy, or is that just based on the independent school district?
Well, that's one of the things, and we in our recommendations to you all, we talk about consistency in the quarantining rules. They're from talking to superintendents all over the state. There's a bit of unevenness out there, and you're going to hear just in a little while from Superintendent Will Hodges at Greene County, who they're using an innovative approach on this test and stay model, and but then in other parts of the state they don't know about that, or they don't have access to it, and so those rules, if we can get much more clarity on that. I talked to a superintendent on the way up here, and the spouse of the teacher tested positive. The teacher is fully vaccinated, no symptoms, and so under the quarantine rules, there was thought, well, she doesn't have to be quarantined. But then the local health department said, yes, she does have to be quarantined. We've had some things where doctors are making decisions and telling certain things that aren't in alignment with the quarantine rules, and so there's a lot of unevenness that we're facing out in the different parts of the state and how quarantines are being implemented. So that would be something that would help us if we could get more uniformity and access to some of these innovative ways to quarantine safely, but to keep people in place.
Representative Wilner joining us online.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Superintendent Flynn, for being with us. As we're having these conversations, I just keep remembering so clearly that on the other side of any policy decisions that we make are real kids and real families and real teachers and real people's lives at stake. And so, I welcome the opportunity to have this conversation. And, I think, it's very clear at this point that the legislature is who owns these decisions. And so I'm really glad that we're taking the opportunity to take this as seriously as I know we all are, and to have these conversations. I'm hearing a lot about, and I think there's a lot of agreement, a lot of consensus around the need for flexibility, including local decision making, including obviously the need for stable funding, addressing the staffing shortages. And one of the shortages I've not heard mentioned yet today, but is custodial staff, that there are shortages there, certainly in the district I represent, and I believe across the state. And while that's always an issue, that's particularly an issue when we're looking at, the need for extra precaution around sanitation and so forth. And you're mentioning, we're hearing also about the need for a long enough term solution to get us till when we're in session again. And, I hope that will include giving a lot of authority to the local districts to be able to make decisions on the fly, which we're not able to do when we're not in session. One of the tools in the tool belt that I've not heard mentioned so far, and I wanted to ask you about it, is a hybrid model, which I know Jefferson County had implemented with some success last year, which would allow teachers to have kids socially distant, which would allow learning to go on, teaching to go on, even when kids are quarantining, when staff members are quarantining, they're able to see some kids in person and some kids not in person. And it felt like a safer option for a lot of folks. And I'm just wondering if that hybrid option is something that we ought to be looking at, and if that's something that you're hearing from your members, Dr. Flynn.
Thank you, Representative Wilner. I have had some discussions with a limited number of folks that have mentioned the hybrid option as one strategy. Last year, a number of districts used that effectively to help as a mitigation strategy, because it allowed them to offer in person, but then do it in a way that the student density in the building was such that they could distance better. One of the things, and superintendents wouldn't be opposed to having that as a tool in the tool box, so to speak. But going back to the local context, last year I know of a district, for example, that decided that they were going to allow any and all that wanted in person to come and have in person. They implemented masking, but because the density level was a limiting factor, they couldn't distance. But guess what? The masking worked at preventing the spread, and they were able to have in-person services effectively. I know of another district that, because of the size of their building and the population density, they were able to distance them so that when they were in place, they could lower the mask and not have to deal with the mask. And so they just masked when they moved, and guess what? It worked. They didn't contribute to the spread at the school level. And so one of the reasons we say, allow the flexibility at the local level to prevail in the decision making is that there's different dynamics in terms of the size of the buildings, the number of students, and what's going on in the community, and those kinds of things that interplay with this. And though we do think there ought to be metrics that we look at the local, regional, and state level to drive those decisions, we have to understand that the size of the population. Just to use for example, the incident rate, at 25 per 100,000, seems like a fairly reasonable number. But in a small county population, then that becomes a real challenge to them because of just so few people infected can push them into orange and red so easily. So that's why we say set of metrics, plural, that we can utilize. And I think there's also some ideas out there about how to get creative with incentivizing more people to get vaccinated that could also help in mitigating the impact of this pandemic. And so I think you're right. In some locales, a hybrid model might be a good option for them. And I would say that superintendents in those areas would like to have that tool on their tool belt if it were available.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jim, my last question very briefly. Have you been given any access to data showing statewide the number of K through 12 students who are positive compared to how many K through 12 students are in quarantine?
I haven't seen any specific data on that. I talked to a number of superintendents, and you'll hear from Superintendent Hodges in a little bit, and he'll share the Greene County data. But the predominant trend is that the vast majority of quarantine students end up not being positive. And certainly almost all of them are being exposed outside of school that end up positive. And so one of the other points I'll make in closing before I step away is that if we just focus only on schools and daycares on these kinds of strategies, we have to recognize that we only have them for 6 or 7 hours, and then when they go out into the community, that's really is what's causing the problems and the challenges inside the school. So we can't forget that side of the equation either.
Greatly appreciated, Jim. Thank you so much for your testimony today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
I'm going to move online to Superintendent Will Hodges, who's joining us for us to discuss quarantining and testing protocols that is being done in the Greene County School District. Mr. Hodges, welcome. And if you would, please identify yourself for the record, and I'll let you start your presentation.
Good afternoon, Chair Wise and Chair Huff and committee members. I'm Superintendent Will Hodges of the Greene County School District.
Will, please proceed.
Okay. Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be here and hope to be able to share with you all, as Jim Flynn talked about, just one more tool to add to the tool belt. We're excited to use a test to stay program here in Greene County. I will give you an overview of that and then allow you to ask any questions that you might have. Let me start by saying very thankful to have the support of the Lake Cumberland District Health Department and Amy Tomlinson. She's been a big supporter and help throughout all this and to our district in our efforts to keep children in classrooms. Also, we couldn't do this without a Cumberland Family Medical. They're our healthcare partner. Ibby Hopper's the director, also our nurses and nurse practitioners, and just the support of our local board and all our staff members here in Greene County. I'd like to say thank you. But we do utilize the Test to Stay program here in Greene County. This is a strategy for local school districts. Very few probably are using this right now just because it has not been promoted statewide, but I think it's a very worthwhile program in our efforts to keep children in classrooms. Let me say this is not easy, but I think we would all say none of this is easy. Every day we get up, we have, your job is tough. Everyone that goes out, we're living in a tough environment right now. Everything we do is tough, but I'll say this, it's worthwhile. And why it's worthwhile is we're finding a way to keep children in classrooms. So a lot of this falls on the backs of our nurses, the nurse practitioner, our healthcare professionals, just because they have to perform this testing on a daily basis. But I will say this, after a peak of a few weeks ago, this has become much more streamlined. It's much more manageable in our school district. Currently, like I said, most districts that are using this probably fall within the Lake Cumberland District Health Department region. Like I mentioned, Amy Tomlinson with that department has stepped out and been very supportive of this and our efforts to keep children in classrooms. This is optional to districts. It is not a mandate of any sort, but this is one more tool that if districts choose and they're aware of this, they could use this to keep children in the in-person setting. And what they have to consider when they do that is, do they have the staffing? Do they have the capability to do that? Having a good healthcare partner like we do with Cumberland Family Medical, I think is crucial. Once again, this is not a mandate to parents. This is optional to parents. If parents do not want their child tested, they can choose the traditional quarantine. So it's optional to parents. I will say this, it's very popular in Greene County. We have found that 80 to 90% of our parents have chosen the test to stay option because they repeatedly say, yes, test them because we want our children in classes. Let me also mention this. This is only for school level exposures. If the exposure happens at school, they can participate in test to stay. This is not for household exposures, only for school level exposures. What we found, most of our exposures that happen at home, they end up being positive, but I'm going to give you some data in a minute, what happens at school level for the school level exposures. So you might ask, how does this work? If a student is exposed at school, they are tested for days 1 through 6. Now, if Saturday and Sunday fall within that window, Saturday and Sunday counts as 2 of those 6 days, but obviously those students do not test on those 2 days. And you might ask, a recommendation I would have is if day 6 falls on a Sunday, I think it's always good to have a 7th day of testing on that Monday, just to make sure those students have remained negative over the weekend. But as long as a student stays negative for days 1 through 6, they remain in school. They remain in school. So they're not quarantined, they're not sitting at home for 2 weeks, but they're able to remain in school. They test every single day, 24 hours apart. So they can spread this test, our nurses can spread this testing out over the course of the day. Not every single student has to test at 7 a.m. Some may test at 7, some may test at 9, some may test at 1 o'clock. That helps our nurses streamline this process. But once they test, the next test is 24 hours apart. Now, we're currently under a mask mandate by the Kentucky Board of Education, but anyone that participates in this program must mask continually while they're at school. So when we started school, masking was optional. We give families, let families make that decision. But even during that time, we told anyone participating in this program that they had to mask while they were at school all the time. Now, to get to the data, which is exciting, we have had in Greene County, our student population is about 1,675 students. We have had 159 students participate in this program. 146 of those students have remained negative the entire time. That's a 92% success rate. So what that means is those 146 students, if they would have had to take the traditional quarantine, those 146 students would have been sitting at home for 2 weeks. But by utilizing this program, which I wish was an option for all school districts, by utilizing this program, those 146 students have had the opportunity to remain in school and participating in in-person classes. Like I said, it is a popular option with our families, and it is an option that most of our families have chosen. But like I said, those 146 have remained in school, and instead of taking that traditional quarantine. And you got to think, what does that mean? Well, not only have those 146 families stayed in school, but maybe those parents of those 146 families may have been able to go to work. And then they may have not been faced with childcare issues on top of that. Number 2, what does this mean by having a 92% success rate? This lets me know that the mitigation strategies that are taking place in schools on a daily basis are working. Since this has a 92% success rate, the spread, like Mr. Flynn said just a while ago, like Dr. Flynn said, the spread is not necessarily taking place at school. We have found that by this 92% success rate, that the mitigation strategy is working, and it's not spreading at school to these exposures. We have found the spread has been in the household. So where does Greene County stand right now? This has drastically cut down on our quarantines. For the most part, the only quarantines we have are household contacts because they can't participate in this program. District-wide, Greene County has 79 students, preschool through 12th grade, that are quarantined. And that's a low number. That's about 5% of our population. So you hear stories of, thousands or whatever. This has been low in Greene County. And I credit a lot of that to the Test to Stay program and the support of our healthcare providers and the health department and being supportive in this. And, you know, we don't have a lot of positives here in the county, and we have few quarantines, and we're able to provide in-person instruction on a daily basis. We're blessed to say we're in day number 22 of the school year. We're thankful for that. And I know it could change tomorrow. Our biggest hurdle is, like everyone else, is with staffing issues. So we're blessed for each day that we have.
Mr. Hodges, thank you for that overview and everything involved in the presentation. My first question to you, in terms of cost or expense. Now, you said this is being done through Cumberland Family Medical, which is a federally qualified health center. I know they're in my district and also with you as well. So, cost to your district, is this free, or what was the service that's being provided?
Cumberland Family Medical has some access to federal funding, so it's of zero cost to our district, zero cost to families, probably more importantly, zero cost to families.
Also, to make everybody aware, Cumberland Family Medical has 250 sites across the Commonwealth serving 40 counties. So I'm not for sure how many counties are using this in terms of Test to Stay. Mr. Hodges, are you aware of any other school districts around you that are using the same model?
Russell County, Adair County, and Cumberland County, which I think are all your districts, or your schools in your district, Senator Wise.
That's correct. Representative Rayburn.
Yes, thank you for letting us know about the plan that's going on there in Greene County schools. May I ask what type of test is being administered? Is it through the nose, or is it a saliva test that's offered at several different hospitals across the state?
It is through the nose. It's the swab of the nose.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Southworth.
Thank you. That's actually a follow-up. Same question. Is this a rapid test or is this a PCR? And how are we handling time, delay, and so forth? I want to dig into that a little bit more.
It is a rapid test. Probably within 15 minutes, they have that result. The nurses in each building typically can perform and read that test. If there's a test that's questionable, it can be sent on to the nurse practitioner. And I think for some of those tests, they have a machine that if it doesn't show up right away, that they can analyze that to determine if it's positive or negative. But most can be performed within 15 minutes. There's not a backlog. We don't test all our students when they get there every morning. So not every single student's tested first thing in the morning. They're spread throughout the day, so there's not a backlog of students. And really, if one does turn positive, you have the same amount of exposures because you've got to back it up 48 hours anyway. But once we start, that student is tested every 24 hours. They're tested at the same time each day. I hope that helps. If I missed anything.
So my constituents are texting me here, and we're talking about the rapid test. It seems like does not do as well on identifying percolating viruses as much as the PCR. And so if a student is non-symptomatic, then is the rapid test telling us anything we don't already know? And if we have to test them each 6 days, I'm just thinking about, at some point, I was hearing apparently we're low on rapid tests in other areas. Are we going to come to a shortage of rapid tests? Do we need to be doing rapid tests if they're not symptomatic and they'll give you a false negative anyway? Or is there some other better way? I mean, this is obviously a science question, not just an education question, but I'm just trying to think of long term. And this is a lot of testing, and I'm on the contracts committee that approves all that federal funding for all these tests. So I'm seeing dollar signs and maybe not going to the best possible use.
Good questions. And for that, I rely solely on our healthcare professionals, Cumberland Family Medical, our health department. They are comfortable, and that, especially since we're doing this over a 6-day window, that we're catching those positive. We have had positives from that, but I do understand your question too about, I've heard the same thing about, the amount of tests that are available out there, the rapid test as well. I've not heard of any issues with Cumberland Family Medical. So in a broader lens, I probably can't answer that just based on here in our region.
Thank you.
Senator Givens.
Chairman Wise, thank you, and Coach Hodges, great to see you. Thanks for your leadership. And I want to echo the compliments you shared, because it is largely your leadership, but it also takes great support staff, great people around you, great folks like the names you've mentioned, people that are dedicated to seeing these students in the classroom. So thank you for your leadership and for all of those classified and certified folks that are making this happen for our students back in my home county of Greene County. We'll speak to the question very briefly. You mentioned 22 days of in-person learning going on. How many NTI days have you had to use?
Currently 0, Senator Givens.
Great. Great. Thanks again.
Yes, sir.
Senator Carroll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I had this discussion with my superintendents yesterday and kind of brought this program up to them. And obviously some concerns with some of the larger schools and especially with the health departments being overextended in our part of the state right now, and schools doing a lot of contact tracing themselves, and the staff requirements that entails has also been an issue. So I like what you said about being able to space the testing out so it's not something that's occurring all at the same time. And I could see that being an option. But as we think through this, I think we're going to have to be creative in the ways that we can create the ability to do this testing. And and I'm also curious from a child care point of view if it's something that perhaps on a voluntary basis might be feasible for child care centers also. And one question with a negative test, I'm assuming you all have a protocol in place that if a student is symptomatic in some way, even though they have a negative test, do you require them at that point to obtain a PCR test?
I'm not sure if I understand your question completely.
So
if they remain negative for that 6-day period, they are released.
Okay, but if they come in and they test negative one morning, but they have some type of symptom, are they?
Okay. Yes. If they have symptoms, I'm sure that healthcare provider, whether it be the nurse or the nurse practitioner, would have them do a follow-up.
Okay,
and
you all haven't had any issues with supplies of the tests themselves?
Senator Carroll, we have not, and I think a lot of that is, as Senator Wise spoke about, Cumberland Family Medical is such a large group. I think they have access to those supplies for their districts.
Do we know if that would be a problem throughout the Commonwealth? Have we gotten that far?
I think that's just for discussion we can have and continue to have. I know those discussion I had with Cumberland Family Medical yesterday, because they are in my district, was they have around 80,000 kits, and that's statewide, servicing anywhere from Elizabethtown, Lawrenceburg, Washington County, and all over.
And what a unique idea, and these are the things that I've been looking for and asking for throughout this process, is to be innovative and to think outside the box. And I think this absolutely does that, and it sounds like that it's being fairly successful. And there may be tweaks to make it even more successful as we start getting more data from the as more schools pick this up. But I think it's very encouraging what's happening to this point. So my compliments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Superintendent Hodges, thank you for coming today. Quick question. I'm also receiving text like Senator Southwood was, and one of the questions was, you mentioned that you're spreading out the testing throughout the day. How much time would you estimate that a student loses in the classroom to get tested?
For our students, they remain in the classroom until it's time to get tested. Once they're tested, it's about 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And one other thing, I just want to make a comment. My wife's in healthcare, and I found out about this about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And when I went home and told her about this idea, she just thought it was fabulous. You know, this is a way of keeping students in class as much as we possibly can, and I hope we can extend it.
Representative Fleming, I think, joining us online.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask a question. I do appreciate your data and your information and the very logical, systematic approach to what you're doing. I think you mentioned that your enrollment's around 1675. I remember theirs around 2,700. I can't remember what Russell is. But my question is, I'm from Jefferson County, and we've got 101,000 students. And I want to see if you have any recommendations or thoughts about scalability of what you're doing and apply it to like Jefferson County in terms of, like I said, having 101,000 kids. Do you have any suggestions or thoughts or words of wisdom of how I can make this scalable?
Yes, I've thought through that. What would you say your average elementary building? How many students in an average?
I'm throwing spaghetti against the wall, probably around maybe 500 to 800.
Okay,
500, 800.
We're approaching 500. So we have one nurse in that building that services those 500 students. I'm guessing probably in each of your buildings. Do you all have a nurse in each building?
My understanding, there is. But I can't quote me on that. I think so.
If there was a nurse in a population of 500, that's approximately what we're doing at our high school. We have 500 students in that. At our lower grades, we have 500. We have a second elementary building in a middle that may have around 400 in those. They all have one nurse. So on average, 400 to 500, we have one nurse in those buildings. They are able to perform those tests by spreading them out over the course of the day. I think what you run into, if you don't have that nurse in the building, if you don't have that healthcare partnership, this would be a difficult task to pull off. But if you do have that partnership, and you have nurses in your buildings and access to those tests to be able to perform those tests, I do think it's something that you can do. You will go through waves and peaks of where you're testing more, and I will say it is tiresome on those staff members. Unfortunately, we've a couple of weeks ago we had a lot. The last couple of weeks we've not had that many.
Okay, I think the high schools, they're around anywhere from maybe 1,900 to 2,300. So what you're telling me is that we'll definitely have to ramp up in terms of having nurses within those schools. And I just got a note from a friend of mine who said that there are several schools that share nurses. So that's going to be a little bit of a challenge, but I guess we'll need to work with JCPS in terms of trying to go through, if that's something we find ourselves in terms of looking at some regulations and statutes.
Yes, sir. I would say if they're sharing nurses, it would be difficult.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Appreciate your comments.
Senator Higdon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's a very good discussion. You mentioned that those students that were exposed at home or other places, you didn't test them. What about a child at school that's symptomatic? I assume you test them, and how many cases of COVID have you detected in that situation?
Yes, in addition to anyone that's exposed through this test to stay program, let's throw all them out. But on a daily basis, we do a lot of testing. If a student comes to the nurse's office and they are symptomatic, the parents are called, and we do have an extensive testing program where they are tested, giving parent permission. So in addition to the test to stay program, we do have a lot of testing that's taken place for those symptomatic individuals. Senator Higdon, I could get you the data from the start of school to today. I can say today we have less than 2% of our population that's positive in the schools.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Hodges, greatly appreciate your comments and your testimony presented today. And I'm hoping that if anyone within the cabinet and Kentucky Public Health is also listening or watching this, that they are also willing and to help local school districts to utilize this type of testing as well. I know some superintendents have reached out and they've kind of been turned away. That it's not been very receptive. So I'm hoping if this is something like Senator Carroll mentioned of outside the box thinking, we can also get state government to work with local school districts in providing the best way forward. And I will also say I'm sure one of the things that's helped in your district for low positivity for students is a slaw burger and a bottle of ski from down there in Greene County. So I know that always helps as well.
Absolutely.
Mr. Hodges, thank you so much for being here. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Next up is Eric Kennedy. Eric is going to be presenting with us to discuss staffing. Eric is the Director of Advocacy for the Kentucky School Board Association. Eric's no stranger to this committee. Eric, if you would, please identify yourself for the record. Please proceed.
Yes, sir. I'm Director. I'm Eric Kennedy, the Director of Advocacy for the Kentucky School Boards Association. So, of course, our members, first and foremost, are all of our school board members in each district, as well as the superintendents. And the good news is I'll be extremely brief because so much ground has been plowed on so many of the topics that our membership agrees on. We have been in close collaboration with the Department of Ed, many of you, some of the other groups, including Superintendent Flynn. So a lot of the things that we've already covered today are concerns that our members have, and some of the possible solutions that may be under control of you as a legislative body, something you can accomplish in a special session, are things that we would also support. I think when you asked me to come today, and thank you for always including us in these discussions, the main thing that you wanted me to talk about was the quarantine issue, and if that is an issue for all school districts. And in fact, I will tell you that I've spoken to a lot of board members and supers in the last few days, including last night. We actually had a regional meeting of several board teams last night, and that is actually the biggest driver, the number one driver of the closures that we have seen of in-person learning or paused in-person learning so far has been staff shortages, and the biggest driver of that is the quarantine, the rules such as they are. In fact, one district told me that the only thing that will cause them to pause in-person learning is going to be if they simply don't have enough adults in a building to operate it safely, which we know has always been true even before COVID. For any other reasons, there's a certain capacity, a certain number of adults that you have to operate a school in person. So that is really the biggest driver of the closures that we've seen. I think the current numbers as of right before the meeting started, 23 districts have announced pausing in-person learning in some way so far this year. Almost every district has begun the school year at this point. I believe at least one Union County, I think today was their first student attendance day. So 23 out of 171 have closed in some way. 9 of those have used some form of NTI days for some of the days they've closed so far. Of course, you know that's about 13% of districts total. That number has been growing, 1 or 2, it seems, almost every day. Everyone that's spoken is correct that the use of NTI days that we've seen so far, some that have not, it does seem to be a concern of what if we need them for weather or something else, even between now and January. But back to the quarantine issue, that is the biggest driver. I'll also say that even before COVID, we all know that we had a staff shortage of all of our employees, not just teachers. The most critical shortage, I believe, is school bus drivers, custodians, and food service staff. If anyone had one magic solution to get all of the people that we need employed in all of our districts, we would have all done it by now. There are many causes for it, and all of our school districts are trying to recruit and retain our staff. The retention is a concern also as part of this, because one of the things that school folks have taken on with COVID, not only doing all of these mitigation steps, but the contact tracing. Essentially all districts, most districts are doing the contact tracing. Health departments in many cases at a certain point earlier in the pandemic kind of turned that over for tracing of possible exposures in the schools. That work is it is a lot of work for school folks to take on. It is a lot of work doing this tracing, reaching out to families. That is also driving some heated conversations, which we don't need any more reasons to drive heated conversations between people in school districts. And so the exhaustion from some of that, especially the contact tracing, is something that we fear is going to push employees out. We cannot, in any district in the state, large or small, all across the state, we cannot afford to lose just a single employee, and we are afraid that some folks are just going to become kind of so exhausted from all of it together that they're going to start walking away from the work. Of course, we just can't let that happen. Many districts have told me that they are down to just one sub for a school, including one of the districts that we were visiting with, the board team last night. They said we have one sub for an elementary school. One board member said that if they lose that one, that she will start volunteering to sub. Anything that can be done to kind of help with the emergency certification or the number of college hours to let a college student become a sub, anything like that would help, certainly to some degree. But the topic that we were just discussing a moment ago of test to stay, definitely if we could get something to clarify for everyone that that is allowable and that is an option, then we would be able to do more work with scaling up the capacity that we have to do it everywhere, which that is a concern. Some folks have told me that they would love to do it, but their provider they're currently using for testing doesn't think they have that capacity. But if we could just get the certainty that this is something clearly possible and allowed, we could work on that. But above all, I just wanted to share with you as we wrap up a long meeting, the most immediate direct thing that could help us with the quarantine issue that's exacerbating our shortage would be if more folks get vaccinated. Not only because of course, we do think that would keep the actual transmission down, but simply because of the rules. And this goes back to Representative Rayburn's question earlier. Because of the guidelines from our state Department for Public Health about the K-12 mitigation steps, the quarantine rules are part of that document from the state. It clearly says that fully vaccinated individuals do not have to quarantine if they've been identified as a possible exposure or a close contact to an exposure. So the fully vaccinated employees don't have to quarantine if they don't show symptoms. So the rules, no matter what else you think about it, simply the rules as they are, it's clear that that is the most direct thing that could help us with the shortages, since so much of it is people that are quarantined that then do not end up testing positive at any time, and after their quarantine window come back to work, especially for the folks that can't work remotely. So our quarantine employees, in many cases teachers and others, they possibly can work remotely even during that time if they are not actually sick. But with our bus drivers, with our food service folks and our custodians, that we actually have a bigger problem with the shortage. Of course, they really can't work remotely. So we just continue to draw attention to that aspect of the guidelines being what they are. I guess conceivably, if you had a school or a school district, if 100% of the employees were vaccinated, I think you would never have any go on quarantine unless they were actually ill. You would not have any go on quarantine purely because of contact tracing, identifying them as a possible close contact to a positive. So that is, when we talk about low-hanging fruit, as we so often do, especially coming up to a special session, and things that you may or may not even be able to do legislatively, just continuing to draw attention to that fact is something that we are trying to do, and we hope everyone joins with us in that.
Eric, thank you. Appreciate your testimony provided today. We have 3 people with questions. Representative Bojanowski.
All right. Thank you. What I really wanted to bring to the table today is some perspective on what I've seen as a teacher in the classroom. And I'll just start, when we started school, I really had an idea about how concerned some students were. When I was walking a second grader up to her classroom for the first day of school, and she looked at me and she said, "Is this school safe?" And it just kind of really touched my heart, and it reminded me about how much our children are caught up in all of this and have concerns themselves. So we do have in our building a school nurse. If we were to do a test and stay type program, depending on how many children needed to be tested throughout the day, we would probably need a second person because she's fairly busy nursing throughout the day, not only children who are potentially ill, but children who also have in a 504 plan or special education plan medical needs that need to be met periodically through the day. I did ask my principal what he would like to, when I'm getting off work, I try to kind of check in with him a little bit, what he would like to bring to the table. And he said there is a concern that they have parents who might have a child who tests positive over the weekend, and they send them to school. And then in a similar situation, there may be a sibling at home who tests positive, but the rest of the kids are sent to school. So that's a concern that he has on the building level. Regarding staffing, teachers as have nurses, very much so, and a lot of other people on the front line who are on the front line. But teachers are feeling overwhelmed. And there are some teachers who were somewhat vulnerable health-wise, and they made a decision to come back into the classroom. And now with the numbers going up, we're not sure how long they're going to stay in. One teacher said, "We are drowning. We don't have enough subs to cover teacher absences. Our classes are sometimes missing a third to a fifth of our kids. And being a mother to an 8-year-old with respiratory issues, I'm a ball of nerves every day." So just, building on the issues for staffing. In JCPS, we do have the advantage that our district teachers who are in other roles, generally not as classroom teacher, they are handling instruction for our students who are in quarantine, which is very helpful. So I did seek some feedback from teachers in the state, and in some districts, teachers are being asked to teach the synchronous and in-person students, so the virtual and the in-person at the same time. And I have to tell you, I tried that for 30 minutes with a special education kindergartner and a couple of kids in my classroom. One virtual, the rest, and it's impossible. So I would not ask any teachers to do that. Concerns about teachers overall. Number one is sick leave. Do I have to use my sick leave if I'm positive for COVID? I go home, I'm sent home, I have sick children, all of that. So the concerns about sick leave. A lot of support for flexibility in an NTI program, whether it be the allowance for a district closure versus possibly a building or a classroom, anything, and that supports Senator Wise in his intent to keep as many kids in school as we possibly can. So also support for some sort of a hybrid issue. And then from the teachers who responded to me, every teacher who responded to me about this issue supported the continuation of a mask mandate in our schools. And there was concern that if the districts at a local level are responsible for that decision, that the decisions may be made with political pressure as opposed to following public health guidance. And I did hear from a school board member, and she said, "As a school board member, I don't see how we have the knowledge necessary to make decisions like metrics for masking. Tensions are so high on the issue, and the social costs of going against community wishes is very hard for school board members. In many communities, the overwhelming majority of people don't want masks, but what does that mean for the child who has a compromised immune system? And then when comparing COVID to the flu, we must remember that parents can vaccinate their children against the flu. Parents of kids under 12 have nothing to protect their children," she stated, "except for universal masking." I did get a couple of responses that were very strongly against any sort of mandatory vaccination for educators. So I wanted to add that feedback.
Representative Bojanowski, really quickly.
Yes.
We have 3 other people behind you. I know you're giving a lot of comments.
Yes.
For Eric Kennedy directly, is there a question? I know I think what you've got is presented to members.
Yes.
That there's what she has got there is slides in terms of comments. Greatly appreciated. Just for Eric's time in the committee.
Yes.
Is there a direct question to Eric?
I just have a statement.
Perfect.
And then I just have one brief final ending. But I do often have very many questions for Eric, which he always answers for me. So once again, from my principal, what else could we think about at the table? And that is the possibility of using our schools to offer vaccinations for under 12-year-olds if and when that becomes an option. I do have a memory of getting, and I looked it up last night, I think it was probably smallpox vaccination at my school when I was a child. And from his perspective, there are a lot of families that would want to take advantage of that type of a vaccination. And if we could facilitate it through the schools, then that might be found, of course, on an opt-in basis, but that might be something that the schools, that would be beneficial to the families. And I Thank you, Chair, for the time to share my thoughts.
Thank you, Representative. Senator West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Kennedy, for the good work you do, and thank you for being here today. You mentioned maybe needing authority or guidance for scaling up for the test to stay. In your opinion, do the schools need this new statutory authority to do this, or can they do it through existing authority? And kind of where I'm going with this is we had a committee meeting the other day, and KBE has used their authority under 156 to do a K through 12 mask mandate. So if they have that authority under 156, do they have the authority to issue guidance on test to stay?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. I think, if anything, it might be something for either the State Department for Public Health or even our local health departments, something either from them or maybe from you sort of involving them. I think when this first came up, when some districts started the test to stay that we heard presented from Superintendent Hodges, other districts heard about it and they would go to their local health department. And that honestly is not really reflected in the guidelines about quarantining. So there's nothing that anyone could look to from the state that said, yes, this is allowed at all anywhere, but there was a lot of interest in it. And there was a lot of questions of, well, how are you doing that in that county? I would like to do it here. So if anything, clarity that it is allowed anywhere, and in fact everywhere as possible, down to our local health departments, more so possibly to them working with their local school districts than necessarily from KDE to the school districts. I think that is where we could use some help and some clarity. I can tell you the earlier question from Representative Bojanowski about teachers or a principal feeling like they were drowning. Last night, one of our superintendents said almost the same thing. She was apologizing for not getting back to me on something, and she said, Eric, I'm snorkeling and the water is at the top of my snorkel. So even something like this, if we can remove any doubt about something at the state level so that the local health departments and the local boards of health that are a big part of this discussion, working with our local school boards, can work out partnerships like what we just heard presented that's working so well in one place.
Thank you.
Senator Thomas.
Thank you, Chairman Wise. And first of all, Chairman Wise, my question goes back to your last statement when you were setting out the agenda for today. And your last statement dealt with when we talked about staffing, we want to incentivize vaccination. And Mr. King, that's where I want to go with my question to you. I know the schools talked a lot at the beginning of this meeting about funding, and money is very important to them. But it seems to me that, in my view, funding ought to be tied to vaccination because vaccination works. We've seen it throughout this country. And it makes no sense to me that we would want to fund schools at a certain level when they're not doing all that they can do to try to stay in school. Because, I am like Senator Wise and like everybody who's spoken today, I want to see our children in school. I think they have to stay in school. Being out of school this past year did not work. A lot of students suffered. But I think that the funding ought to be tied to vaccination. We ought to encourage our staff, our teachers, what's the word I'm looking for? Not certified staff.
Classified.
Thank you, Representative Decker. Our classified staff and students. Beginning in middle school right now, you 12 and older, you can get vaccinated. My granddaughter turns 12 in January. I've told my son and my daughter-in-law that she's going to get vaccinated, and they agreed. So what's your opinion of tying funding to vaccination in the schools?
Are you thinking tying the funding that a district may receive to or the funding, like a funding incentive to employees to get vaccinated?
Funding to what the district may receive.
Okay.
Because that's what the schools want. They want money. Let's tie that to some kind of formula for vaccination.
Well, I think that might get a little problematic because for us, we always want to prevent any sort of either mandates or funding restrictions on things that are largely out of control of the district itself and the district leadership. There is a lot of interest and a lot of discussion, even nationally and here, about various ways you can give an incentive from the district to the employees to get vaccinated. There have been some questions that have come into us in terms of, can we do that, or what could you do? Could you do some things, not others? Unfortunately, like so much of everything, that there's kind of a gray area in terms of the laws in place for districts and paying folks off a single salary schedule versus discrimination law from the feds over how far can you go with an incentive to do a vaccine before it becomes almost coercive, which you cannot do. So that discussion, I assure you, is happening. We are trying to get some clarification on what exactly that could look like for local districts to then consider, do we want to do that or not? Short of that, we keep just reiterating the point of there are many reasons why this sort of automatically is tied into the guidelines that are in place and how much we are quarantining and whether or not we're going to run to the point of not enough buildings in the school to be open. That ties back to the vaccination rate, short of until we can figure out what incentives could possibly look like.
Senator Southworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a kind of an eclectic pile of short questions. The first, do the hours in the classroom really matter? As far as funding, we were hearing earlier talking about ADA versus ADM and all this. Do the hours really matter at the end of the day? I know we've done laws before about letting districts cut off school days if they got too many snow days. Is this really an issue that we need to be worried about, or can we just shorten some hours and say, oh, well? I mean, from student experience myself and my constituent students that I hear from, there's a ton of hours that aren't just, so important that we can't just say, okay, oh, well.
Yes, thank you. I think the primary way that those two issues are tied together in state statute is that there's a statute that says in order for a district to receive any SEEK funding, it has to do certain things, and they're just a long list. And one of those is the minimum number of hours and the minimum number of days that those hours can occur on. So those are also two separate things. I think at least slightly over 1,000 hours of instruction on at least a certain number of different days of the year. So there's that's really just sort of a requirement to get funding at all. And then how much funding you receive then is tied to the daily attendance. So it's not so much the hours attended during a day, but then just the daily attendance. So they're tied together that way in terms of to get any funding, all the districts are required a certain number of hours in the year and a certain days, and then how much funding you receive is the daily attendance rate.
But we're the legislature and we're the ones that set that in the first place, so we could change that, right?
I believe so.
Okay, so the next question is for the parent or the adult count in the buildings. Does that include like parent volunteers, or does that have to be like classified staff and all this kind of stuff?
Yes, and there is nothing to my knowledge in statute that has a certain number or ratio when we're talking about there's a certain number of adults in the building you have to have school safely. There's not any hard-coded number, and I don't want to make it seem like there is, but that's sort of back to the concept we've discussed, I think, earlier today of even before COVID, you would have sometimes just a really bad flu year, and some days a district would close out and say it's a flu day. And there was never any 1 percentage point of daily attendance where a superintendent makes that call. So it's a similar thing here. Given the local experience within a building or a district, that's something that, similar to calling off for snow, how many people you have on site to do things safely is going to be different everywhere. But who that might include, yes, I think you're talking about all employees, certified, classified, any volunteers you have, just the adults to be supervising kids, watching kids, helping do everything you need to do, could include, I think, volunteers, and I think is part of what they would have in mind.
Okay, one final follow-up, Mr. Chairman. So in a scenario where you have somebody that has symptoms of something and they test negative, and maybe it's finally determined or undetermined what they have, allergies, sinus infection, just you name it. One of the questions I have from one of my constituents, that's one of these scientific names, I'm not sure exactly what all it is, but where did the flu go? Because do we have students, we're not testing for the flu to determine whether they've got the flu. And that's just one example, but I heard the science last year was 99% down on flu numbers. And so my constituent, I asked him about this, he said, well, it's unclear exactly why the flu seems to have disappeared, although we don't really collect the data on the flu that we collect on COVID. And we have to seriously consider what percentage of COVID cases are essentially what we would have called flu before 2020. With that in mind, my question is, as a long-term process moving forward, and you were talking about in the ideal world, 100% vaccination, we wouldn't need a quarantine unless we were actually seeing people were sick. That's what we used to do with the flu. I mean, am I wrong? So is there a way that we can all maybe relieve our mental stress over unseen particles and go by our eyeballs on in regardless of vaccination? Because I mean, there's new studies coming out now all the time. You know, Las Vegas, I think they've got 60% of their hospitalized vaccinated. You know, I mean, it's looking like it doesn't matter. I mean, we heard testimony from, there's another state legislature that had testimony, I think last week, about how, you know, the vaccine doesn't work for the variant. Okay, well, if that's the case, who cares if they're vaccinated? You know, this is a new thing. So as we move through all these things, what is the possibility that we can actually get our students in school, relieve mental stress, and use our eyeballs on the obvious and not worry about the numbers or the data as much as just what we see and experience like we used to, snow days or flu days?
I think that is probably outside of my experience to really answer that question, but to get to the point that I think that you're making, that I think is a valid point, there is a national discussion happening in several media articles that have come out in some of the education publications even this week of, are we over or under quarantining students and staff? That I think is part of what you're getting to, because for us, and at the meeting that we had last night, several of the board members and superintendents said, you know, we are not health experts. We are really education experts and leaders. We need our local board of health and the state health experts to really help do a lot of this. And so the questions of what kind of testing do you have, when do you quarantine, and what that looks like, I think for school people, we just looked first and foremost to just the guidelines that are in place governing us at any moment, which, because of how they're written now, the vaccine issue is what makes that sort of a direct issue for us, is it says fully vaccinated don't have to quarantine. So I think the bigger questions of, you know, how the tests work, what tests we use, how we should be testing, I would say that's over and beyond me and even my membership that I'm representing. It's beyond some of the school folks, and some of our health experts should weigh in on that, I think.
Thank you.
Representative McCool.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Kennedy, for being here today. In regards to the shortage, I heard a lot of conversation about the staff and bus drivers, and that may be more of a process that we need to look at as well. But regarding for teachers, I believe we passed a bill last year, 163, that allows to go back and hire retired teachers. Is that being utilized now to help with the shortage, and is that working? Do we need to tweak it?
I think so. The issue of retired teachers coming back to work, rehiring, the rule's all about return to work for the TRS system, especially with the teachers and the teachers' retirement system. That is definitely being used. I think we are really maximizing, and we meaning the district leadership, trying to recruit these folks to come back. I think we are really maximizing the people that are retired, getting them to come back, be it full-time or to sub. I think it's our understanding from discussions we've had with staff at TRS, the general counsel, and the leadership there, some of those rules are limitations at the federal level that we may not be able to change, even you may not be able to change it, only in state law. And so I'm not sure how much farther we can go with relaxing some of those. I think what's in place now, it has helped, certainly. We are maximizing it. We, especially for subs, I mean, we need any of our retired teachers that are able and willing to come sub any place in any district to do that. So I think more discussion definitely needs to be happening. As Superintendent Flynn said, we completely support, as far as we possibly can go, to relax the rules on return to work for our retired teachers. But the laws that you have passed are definitely helping and being used.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Eric, the last question, the committee, Representative Rayburn.
Thank you. Eric, could you tell me what percentage of absentees, both for students, teachers, and staff, what would that number have to be in order for the schools, not to be able to afford to be open any longer?
So that is interesting. There is no one number that is, because every district is different in terms of the staff they have and the students. The diversity of districts really impacts a lot of why we need local flexibility and local decision-making statewide. So what the number is of what is your student attendance rate, where does it fall where you sort of need to close even for an old-fashioned flu day, the way we used to have them, or staff for that matter, that's always going to be different. Anecdotally, a lot of discussions happen lately. A lot of finance officers and supers have told us for them in the past, it's hovered around 85 to 87%, that when their student attendance gets to that point, they usually have considered closing for a day or two, traditionally, even before COVID for other reasons. But what makes that interesting is if the General Assembly in a special session or the regular session were to say the ADA fix that was discussed earlier in the meeting, if you were to say, for just one more year, we all hoped and dreamed that we would be kind of past this point, but we're not. For just one more year, we'll base the attendance on a prior year ADA, maybe with some adjustment for growth districts. At any point, if you kind of set that in stone and we have that clarity to rely on, that changes everything about the daily discussions and decisions being made of having in-person school open, no matter what your attendance rate is or no matter how many students are quarantined at home or in school, because just the nature of the beast of having the funding tied to attendance, that is this major driver of that decision of do we need to close or not. So that being said, if that were to happen, if a special session happens soon, and if you were to pass that for this year, for the rest of this year, district leaders then, even if their daily attendance falls below 85% of students, they probably will be still trying to remain open, as I think Superintendent Flynn said earlier. We all, top to bottom, want as much in-person happening safely as much as we possibly can for as many students as we can. So even if you got down below 85%, knowing that now is not going to directly impact your funding from SEEK in the next year, because we've sort of set that in stone, you really, that decision point is, the discussion is entirely different, which is part of why we also fully support that being something that we do at least, hopefully one more time before we kind of get past some of this, we hope.
Follow-up question. So as you've mentioned, that there is a certain percentage rate. Do districts have a plan in place that they, kind of a guideline that they go by before they utilize that NTI day, whether it be a percentage or a certain number? And if so, can you shed light on what those numbers are? Does it stay within the 85 to 87% range?
I think, no, I really, the decision that happens and always happened even before COVID of usually it was for snow days. So the local decision when you would wake up in the morning, especially if you had kids, and you would turn on the news to see if there was going to be a snow day that day. And then if you were listening to see, is it going to be an NTI day or just a snow day? That decision is usually made with a lot of different things taken into consideration, and usually not really anything about the percentage rate of attendance. So sometimes it's, at any given point, how many days you've already used. If you think that your families and students are kind of tired at that point and maybe they just need just a snow day with no work happening, so we're not going to use an NTI day, it's just a snow day. That is based on a lot of really intangible, subjective sort of considerations more than any specific percentage rate. And so currently now, and we see that now, so for the districts, for the 23 districts total that have paused in person for some number of days, 9 of them have used NTI to count some of those days so far. For all the districts that haven't, it's that subjective feeling of, that we discussed earlier, well, we're going to close because of staff shortage or student illness rates and quarantine. Then are we going to use an NTI day in our NTI plan for this day or not? So are we going to ask our families to do this NTI work at home for the day or not? Those decisions, more than anything, have been thinking of the unknown of, are we going to have more quarantines and even get worse next week? Or are we going to have a bad snow next month and wish we hadn't used them up yet? So those decisions are really from some of those factors, not so much anything tied to the actual percentage of attendance you have.
So I do have one additional question. So I had asked a little bit earlier, I believe it was Jim, about, if a teacher or a student shows proof of vaccination, they don't have to quarantine. So as we talk about the numbers in some of my districts, quarantine numbers are high, super high. And then there's even numbers due to exposure, especially with the teachers. So as I asked that question, we're talking about a shortage of teachers and substitute teachers as well. And that certainly would be a factor in, closing down a school. I guess my statement rather would be we need to have a common goal here of, are we allowing the proof of vaccination to serve so that someone doesn't have to quarantine due to an exposure, and kind of a proper guideline. I've got here the emergency regulation that was signed by Kentucky Board of Education that, says that paid quarantine leave time, would be served to the teachers. So I guess I'm trying to wrap all this up and figure out how can we get everyone on the same page here.
But that would help on so many issues. By going back to the feeling of exhaustion, whether it's the principals or the superintendent and the water's at the top of the snorkel, part of the exhaustion is things keep changing, which now, of course, we are now here asking for some things to change from you, hopefully soon in a special session. So in some ways, I'm asking for a few more changes to help us move forward. And yet also part of the issue that's causing so much exhaustion is the things that have changed so often up until this point that is causing a little bit of lack of uniform approach to things and lack of consistency. So to your question of what is this looking like when someone tests positive or you're informed at the school that someone has tested positive and that contact tracing begins and you start measuring, okay, where was this person the last time they were here? Who was within 3 or 6 feet of this person? And you start thinking of who then is going to be a close contact that will need to quarantine under the rules as they are. I think the rules in this document, it's a statewide document from the state public health officials, so they are consistent. And when we discussed earlier, they are used, perhaps not so much that they're used inconsistently, but just that process is, not a precise science of looking at where were people sitting yesterday, measuring things out, thinking of, well, what teachers were close to this other teacher or employee or student. In the real world implementation, when this is happening by school people in the school day. So it's a lot of work. The contact tracing is a lot of work. I think people are doing it the best they can. When so many different people are doing this and using a document to do this and actually implement it in so many places, it's never going to be exactly the same everywhere. But we do at least have clearly the guidance is fully vaccinated persons do not need to quarantine. That part's in bold. Following an exposure to a person unless they are experiencing symptoms. So we keep driving people, there's no substitute for just trying to literally get on the same page, get the same document in front of everyone and keep going over this same guidance.
Thank you.
Eric, thank you so much. We've gone past the 2-hour limit of the meeting. I would ask that all members who continue to receive input from your constituents, superintendents, teachers, educators across the board, please collect those. Please send those to my direction. Happy to take those. If anybody's listening and watching remotely, also contact your legislators with anything that we're discussing right now. I thought this was a very good open discussion. I appreciate all of our presenters. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for your questions today. Do we have a motion for adjournment? Ed Massey, so moved.